This is Kenny Tam. Welcome to Real Estate License in 14 Weeks. This is episode 5, starting from 0. Non-Freehold Estate, part 2. And we're still talking about leases. If you have not watched episode 4, please do so before you watch episode 5. It will make it easier to understand what I'm going to share with you on episode 5. First, we're going to talk about transfer by lessee. There are two ways a lessee, which is also known as tenant, can transfer the lease to someone else. As you know, a leasehold is a non-freehold. So whatever transfers that the tenant wants to do must be with the consent of the landlord. The first kind of transfer by a lessee or a tenant is known as an assignment. So what is an assignment? An assignment is a transfer of the entire lease or entire leasehold. For example, if a tenant runs a business out of a warehouse that is 10,000 square feet in square footage, and if the tenant wants to get out of the lease by transferring the lease to a new tenant, that will be a transfer of the entire lease and it's with the consent of the landlord. And therefore, that is an assignment. Now, in the case of an assignment, what are the responsibilities between the tenant and the subtenant toward the landlord? Once an assignment is consented to by the landlord, the original tenant will be released from the lease. That means that the original tenant no longer has the obligation to pay rent to the landlord. Rather, is the new tenant. There is a special name for the new tenant. We'll call the new tenant assignee. Assignee, the new tenant, will then have the obligation to pay rent to the landlord. And the assignor, the old tenant, is completely released from the lease. The second type of transfer by a lessee is known as a sublease. A sublease is only a transfer of the partial. It's a partial transfer of a lease. A lease can be partially transferred in terms of square footage or in terms of time of use. Now, in terms of square footage, for example, now using the earlier example where a tenant has 10,000 square feet warehouse. Now, let's say instead of completely getting out of the warehouse. In other words, the tenant, even though he no longer has a use for 10,000 square feet, may decide that he only needs a small portion of the warehouse. Say, for example, the tenant only wants to use 5,000 square feet as opposed to 10,000. So the tenant would want to negotiate with the landlord to allow him to transfer the other 5,000, in other words, the remaining 5,000 to someone else. So a transfer of partial leasehold in terms of the square footage is a sublease. Now, a sublease can also be in the form of percentage of use. Say, for example, there are 4 seasons in a year. Now, some people rent a property on a fixed term basis. Say, for example, certain months of the year, he doesn't want to live on the property. He wants to sublease it to someone else who would prefer to only lease it, say, for example, during the summer month to do certain business. Now, when he rents out the property during the summer months, he rents out the entire property. So even though he rents out the entire property, but it is only for certain times of the year, that's also considered a sublease. Now, in a sublease situation, the tenant, who is now what we call a sublessor, so the tenant becomes a landlord himself, a sublessor, is still liable to the landlord. The sublessor, the original tenant, still have an obligation to pay the full amount of rent to the landlord. However, the sublessor can look to the sublessee for whatever rent amount that they agree on. I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, the warehouse is leased for $10,000 a month. And the tenant, the original tenant, who is now the sublessor, could pay the full $10,000 to the landlord, but the sublessee pays $5,000 to the sublessor. In other words, the sublessor will look to the sublessee for whatever rent amount that the sublessee owes him. So eventually, the sublessor will still pay $10,000, even though the 50% of the rental payment come from the sublessee. Next, we're going to talk about termination of the lease. There are different ways to terminate a lease. Number one is by written notice. If a landlord and a tenant is in a month-to-month tenancy, if the tenant has been on the property for a year or longer, legally, if the landlord wants to terminate the tenancy, the landlord must give 60-day notice as opposed to a 30-day notice. 30-day notice is only allowed if the tenant has not lived there for at least a year. On the other hand, if it is the tenant who wants to terminate a month-to-month tenancy, regardless of how long the tenant has lived there, all the tenant has to do is to give the landlord a 30-day notice. The second way a lease can be terminated is what we call abandonment. What is abandonment? An example of abandonment would be a situation where the tenant could not be found. In other words, the landlord doesn't know where the tenant is at. All the landlord knows is that the tenant has left the premises. Now, in this situation, if the landlord accepts the abandonment, then the lease is considered terminated. So this is what we call an abandonment. The third way a lease can be terminated is when there is a breach of quiet enjoyment and possession. What that means is, as previously mentioned, if there is a leaky roof, for example, and the tenant has notified the landlord to fix the leaky roof, and the landlord has still failed to do it. In that case, the lease can be terminated by the tenant by using what we call constructive eviction or actual eviction, where the tenant basically say that I can't live here anymore because the house is not habitable. Therefore, I consider the lease terminated. The fourth way to have a lease terminated is what we call condemnation. Condemnation means sometimes a property can be taken by the government for public use. Let's say, for example, a property is located in the route of a governmental project, such as a bullet train. Now, if the government wants to build a bullet train at a location where the property is located, the government will take the property from the landlord. In that case, the tenant can no longer lease the property. This is what we call condemnation. Number 5, commercial frustration. What is commercial frustration? Let's say, for example, the government changed the zoning for that property such that the tenant could not make legal use of the property anymore. Now, due to zoning change, as a result of that zoning change, whatever use that the company had agreed to lease the property for is no longer legal. And this is what we call commercial frustration. Therefore, the tenant has the right to terminate the lease. Number 6, court action. Now, if the tenant doesn't pay rent before the lease can be terminated, there is a procedure called unlawful detainer. If you've been a landlord and you have been involved in eviction to get a tenant out of your property, the procedure is called unlawful detainer. It's just a special name. For exam purposes, unlawful detainer is frequently tested in the DI exam, so you need to know what unlawful detainer means. You go to court and get the tenant evicted, and then the court will declare the lease is terminated. That's what we call court action to get a lease terminated. Finally, number 7 is what we call surrender. You know, in a very difficult economic environment, for example, the business is getting to be very bad for the tenant, so the tenant can no longer pay the rent. So in that case, the tenant might want to approach the landlord and say, how about I give up on the lease? That's what we call surrender. And it's by mutual agreement. Both the tenant and the landlord agree that the lease is prematurely terminated before the due date has arrived. We call that surrender. Now let's talk about the landlord's recourse when a tenant fails to pay rent. Number one, the landlord can sue the tenant as its installment of rent becomes due, whether or not the tenant remains on the property. For example, if the tenant owes 1 month's rent, the landlord can go to court and sue that tenant for just that 1 month's rent. Now, whether or not the landlord wants to do that, that's totally up to the landlord. The second way to recover the lost rent or damages will be in situation perhaps the tenant might have left the premises and no longer pay rent. Now, if the tenant has left and indicated to the landlord that the tenant no longer wants to have the lease anymore, so the second option would be for the landlord to take over possession of the property, clean it up, and then find a replacement tenant while still go after the previous tenant for lost rent. The third option that the landlord has when the tenant fails to pay rent would be to serve a 3-day notice on the tenant. So basically the landlord will have the 3-day notice post at the premises for the tenant to read it. So when the tenant receives the 3-day notice, hopefully to the landlord, the tenant will pay the rent. Now, if the tenant doesn't pay the rent after the 3 days period has expired, the landlord can go to court and file what we call unlawful detainer and regain possession of the premises. There you have it. Next, we're going to talk about types of leases. Essentially, there are 3 important types of leases. Number one is called what we call a gross lease. Say, for example, a residential lease is typically a gross lease. For example, on a residential lease, you would expect the landlord to pay for the property taxes and pay for the maintenance. A landlord doesn't do that. That is what we call a gross lease. The second type of lease is what we call a net lease, also known as triple net, or simply N. Now, what is a triple net lease? A triple net lease will consist of a base rent that the tenant would pay, and then on top of that, instead of having the landlord pay for property taxes, maintenance, and so forth, the landlord basically doesn't pay for any of this type of expenses. It is the tenant who pays for property tax, maintenance, and insurance. So that's what we call a net lease. The third type of lease is what we call a percentage lease. What is a percentage lease? A percentage lease will be typical of a lease that you will find in a shopping mall, for example. You go to a big shopping mall, for example, a tenant who has a retail store that sells clothing. Now, on top of the base rent that the tenant pays to the landlord has a right to receive a certain percentage of the sales volume that the tenant is able to make. For example, the more sales that the tenant does, the more rent the landlord can collect, because the landlord has a percentage cut of each sale that the tenant makes on top of the base rent. That is what we call a percentage lease. This is the end of episode 5. On the next episode, we're going to be finishing up on leases and get into real property. If you like my video, I would appreciate if you give me a thumbs up. If you want to receive future notification of new releases of my video, please remember to subscribe and also remember to click the bell. That way you will receive first notification. See you next time.